The flight was smooth, passengers were settling into their seats, and the crew was quietly working as usual when suddenly, smack! A sharp slap tore through the silence. A gasp swept through first class and all eyes turned towards the sound. A flight attendant stood frozen, her hands still raised, her chest heaving with explosive anger. Before her stood an old man, still as a statue, his face chillingly calm, his hand tightening around the handle of his cane. She had humiliated him, treated him like trash, dared to raise a hand to him, but the damn little thing didn't know who she had just messed with. And when this miserable plane landed, her career would be reduced to ashes. But before diving into the story, shout out which corner of America you're watching this drama from. From sunny Texas or freezing New York. If you like stories like this, smash that like button, subscribe now, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing. Hello there. You're listening to an exciting story on the Soul Deep Stories YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Even more amazing, I have a special message for you. If you leave a comment sharing the name of your country and your current time zone, that means fate has brought us together every day. Now let's dive in and enjoy this fascinating story together. JFK Airport was as crowded as a flea market today, people pushing and shoving to get to the gate, the loudspeaker echoing through the terminal. Amidst the chaos, John Maverick walked, slowly but steadily, his cane tapping rhythmically on the polished floor. His shoulders were broad, his back straight, still looking strong despite his age, but his left leg had a slight limp, an old wound that never fully healed, a remnant of his years shedding blood in the military. He wasn't in any rush, he had flown hundreds of times, but this trip was different. This time he wasn't just any passenger. Reaching the gate, he handed his ticket to the clerk with a polite nod. The young girl at the counter, Sarah Miller, glanced at the ticket and gave a bland, formulaic smile, the kind she gave to anyone in first class. Sarah Miller, the ticket agent, didn't even bother to look up at John Maverick. She just glanced at the ticket and scanned it. She tossed him a fake smile, the kind of flat smile she gave to any guy in first class. No emotion, no respect. But for John it didn't matter. He didn't need anyone cheering him on, didn't need curious glances. He just wanted to sit down and enjoy a peaceful flight and be done with it. Stepping onto the plane, John adjusted the strap of his small bag and walked heavily towards first class. Plush leather seats were neatly arranged, some people already seated, sipping wine or scrolling on their phones as if the world had to wait for them. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee, and whispered conversations floated like smoke. John reached his seat, put down his bag and prepared to sink into the chair when, "Hey you!" A voice as sharp as a knife cut through the air. He turned his head, encountering Jennifer Brooks, the arrogant head flight attendant standing in the aisle. One hand on her hip, the other clutching a manifest. She was tall and slender, her uniform crisp, her blonde hair styled as if she had just stepped out of a salon. Her face was cold, but her eyes, God, those eyes, seemed to scream that he was an outcast who didn't belong here. John remained calm, his voice deep and even. "No, I believe this is my seat." Jennifer sneered, looking him up and down as if appraising an old piece of furniture. Worn leather jacket, cane leaning against the seat, deep wrinkles etched on his face. She glanced at the ticket but didn't bother to take it. "This cabin is for first-class passengers," she emphasized, her voice hard as stone, as if he were an idiot who didn't know where he was. John exhaled slowly, trying to suppress a frustrated sigh. "I know. That's why I have a first-class ticket here." He held out the ticket, patient to the point of annoyance. But Jennifer didn't bother to take it. She crossed her arms, her voice sharp, deliberately speaking loudly so the whole cabin could hear. "Listen buddy, this seat is for VIP passengers. If you got accidentally upgraded, I'll help you find a seat in coach, got it?" Some passengers looked up from their screens, some pretended not to see, others curiously glanced over as if watching a play. John's hand tightened on the cane, but his voice remained as calm as a winter lake. "There's no mistake. This is my seat." Jennifer huffed, the kind of sigh of someone who has run out of patience and is about to do something stupid. Jennifer snatched the ticket from John Maverick's hand, skimming the information as if reading a piece of trash. For a moment, her face faltered, probably noticing something amiss, but instead of backing down, she shoved the ticket back into his hand without so much as an apology. "Do you have proof of purchase?" she asked, her voice curt like a knife. "Or did someone buy it for you?" John clenched his jaw, the implication in her words clear as day. She thought he was penniless, unable to afford a first-class seat. Before he could open his mouth, her damn patience ran out. Suddenly, she grabbed his arm, snatching the ticket back again. "You get up now. I need you to get out of here, you're delaying everyone from boarding." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the cabin. A businessman in the front row, Mike Donovan, frowned and turned around. Good heavens, you don't have to treat him like that. But Jennifer paid him no mind, her eyes fixed on John as if he were a sworn enemy. And then, before anyone could understand what was happening, she did something that stunned the entire first-class cabin. She slapped him, a quick, sharp slap that echoed like thunder. The smack tore through the air, freezing the cabin. A woman in the front row, Rachel Harper, gasped, her hand clamped over her mouth. A guy behind muttered, "What the hell?" A young flight attendant near the galley, Ethan Parker, whirled around, his face drained of color. But John didn't flinch. He didn't touch his face, didn't groan, just stared at her. And right then, everything changed. The power Jennifer thought she held dissolved like smoke, because she had no idea who she had just laid her hands on. A heavy silence filled the first-class cabin, taut as a drawn bowstring. Passengers glanced at each other, bewildered, unable to believe their eyes. Some fidgeted in their seats, others stared wide-eyed, their gazes darting back and forth between John and Jennifer. John remained motionless. He had been through battles, had seen people crumble under pressure, had endured things 100 times worse than a slap from this arrogant little woman. The blow didn't faze him, his face remained expressionless, but inside, a dangerous calm arose. And Jennifer? She was still clinging to that illusory power, her face contorted with irritation as if she were the victim. "I'm not going to ask again," she snapped. "Get up and go down to economy now, or I'll call security." The passengers began to stir, their whispers growing louder. Mike Donovan turned all the way around, his voice filled with outrage. "Are you kidding me? He has a ticket and you dare." He cut himself off, shaking his head in disgust. "You can't just put your hands on passengers like that." Jennifer glared at him, her eyes as sharp as knives. "Stay out of it, this is none of your business." Ethan Parker, the young flight attendant nearby, was pale as a ghost. He'd seen Jennifer be cold to passengers before, but this was different. This was a mess about to explode. His hands trembled, wanting to intervene but afraid to do so. John slowly exhaled, adjusting the handle of his cane. When he spoke, his voice was deep but as cold as steel. "You should think carefully about your next move." That voice gave Jennifer pause for a second, but she quickly puffed out her chest, determined not to lose. "I don't take orders from passengers." To prove it, she reached out to grab his cane. John tightened his grip, his voice dropping, chilling to the bone. "Don't." Just one word, but it roared, making her recoil. Passengers gasped softly, the shift in power palpable. A woman in seat 3C whispered to her husband, "She's digging her own grave." Then everything turned upside down. The speaker in the cabin crackled, and a deep, authoritative voice boomed, "Jennifer Brooks, report to the cockpit immediately." No room for argument. Jennifer stiffened, a flicker of panic crossing her eyes, but she quickly masked it and stomped forward, her heels clicking loudly on the carpet. Ethan took a step forward, hesitantly asking, "Are you all right, sir?" John leaned back in his seat, brushing off his sleeve as if nothing had happened. "I'm fine," he said evenly, "but she isn't." Mike Donovan glanced towards the cockpit, smirking. "She's about to find out who she just messed with." Jennifer Brooks marched forward, her heels clicking sharply, her face flushed. It was unclear whether from anger or anxiety. The call to the cockpit spooked her. A lead flight attendant like her wasn't summoned unless something major had happened. Passengers watched her go, the murmuring growing louder as she disappeared from view. In first class, John readjusted himself, his shoulders relaxing, every movement slow and deliberate. He didn't need to shout to command respect. He exuded it naturally without explanation or proof. That was the difference between him and someone like Jennifer. Ethan Parker still lingered near the galley, wringing his hands, nervously leaning down to whisper to John, "Sir, I saw everything." She was way out of line. John tilted his head, looking at the young man for a moment before replying, "What are you going to do about it?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He always followed orders, always avoided trouble to keep the peace on the flight, but this was different. Before he could answer, Mike Donovan leaned across the aisle, smirking, "You don't have to do anything, kid. This has already been taken care of." Ethan blinked. "How so?" Mike chuckled under his breath. "You'll see." Jennifer knocked on the cockpit door twice, still seething. The door opened and she stepped inside, expecting to find only the captain. But no, two people were waiting. Captain Daniel Hayes sat there, his face expressionless, and next to him on the communication system screen was a man, impeccably dressed in a black suit, arms crossed, eyes cold as ice. Jennifer's stomach clenched. She recognized him immediately. Grayson Carter, one of the airline's top executives, a direct subordinate of the chairman. Her mouth went dry. Grayson didn't speak immediately, just stared at her for a few seconds, the silence suffocating. Then his voice boomed through the speaker icily, "Brooks, we need to talk about what just happened in first class." Jennifer felt cold sweat break out on her back. She knew she wouldn't be leaving the cockpit in the same way she had entered. Her heart pounded, but she tried to stand tall, refusing to break. She had handled difficult passengers, quelled countless situations, and navigated years of internal airline politics. But this was different. This wasn't a minor incident. This was a disaster. Grayson's voice rang out again, calm but as sharp as a knife. "Explain to me why a first-class passenger was assaulted on your flight?" The question was like a slap in the face. Jennifer tightened her jaw, immediately going on the defensive. "Sir, there was a misunderstanding. The passenger didn't look like someone who belonged in first class and Grayson inhaled sharply, cutting her off. "Didn't look like it?" Captain Hayes folded his arms, speaking for the first time. "Brooks, we reviewed the boarding gate footage. The passenger presented a valid first-class ticket." Jennifer swallowed hard. They had seen everything. She licked her lips, trying to find a way out. I was just making a judgment call. I thought there was a system error. I just wanted to enforce airline policy?" Grayson Carter growled, his face darkening. "What goddamn policy allows you to slap a paying passenger?" Jennifer Brooks stood frozen, unable to offer a single excuse. The atmosphere in the cockpit was stifling, the silence dragging on until it was suffocating. Then Grayson delivered the final blow. "Do you know who that passenger is, Brooks?" Jennifer's eyes darted back and forth between him and Captain Daniel Hayes. The way they were looking at her, as if they wanted to tear her apart, told her she was finished. "His name is John Maverick," Grayson continued. Jennifer frowned. The name sounded familiar, but only when Grayson lowered his voice, chilling her to the bone, did she understand. John Maverick is one of the founding investors of this airline. A decorated war hero and, listen carefully, he owns a substantial chunk of this company's stock. The blood drained from Jennifer's face, leaving her as white as a corpse. "You didn't just slap some random passenger, Brooks," Grayson's voice was heavy as a hammer. "You slapped a man who could kick your ass out of here before this goddamn plane even touches the ground." Jennifer's knees trembled. She had spent her entire life commanding on flights, making everything bend to her will, but what now? She had nothing left in her hand. Daniel Hayes leaned forward, his voice stern. "Go back to first class immediately. You will apologize to Mr. Maverick in front of everyone." Grayson added, his voice sharp as a razor. "And when the plane lands, you will drag your ass to the company office for a review. Depending on the outcome, don't dream of working here again." Jennifer opened her mouth but couldn't utter a word. For the first time in her life she felt completely helpless. And the worst part was that she had dug this hole for herself. Jennifer left the cockpit, her steps slow as someone being led to the gallows, her stomach churning with terrifying fear. She had built her career on power, on control, everything in the cabin had to follow her orders. But now, she was being ordered around like a dog. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on her. Some had witnessed the slap, others had overheard rumors, but all of them knew something big had happened. The air was heavy, taut as if it was about to explode. She stopped right in front of John's seat in first class. He was still sitting there, his back straight, his cane resting against his leg, his face expressionless, not angry, just patient, the kind of patience that churned her insides. Mike Donovan, sitting nearby, smirked. "Taking your sweet time, aren't you, dear?" Jennifer gritted her teeth, trying to ignore him. Her hands were clammy, and for the first time in years she was at a loss for words. Apologize to a passenger? Never. She took a deep breath, forcing a strained smile. "Mr. Maverick, I would like to sincerely—" John raised his hand, cutting her off, his voice deep and even, "Make it sound believable." Passengers craned their necks, the atmosphere as taut as a bowstring. Jennifer tightened her jaw, but there was no choice. She forced herself to look him in the eye. "I apologize for treating you poorly," the words as bitter as swallowing poison. "I shouldn't have questioned your ticket, and I definitely shouldn't have laid a hand on you. I was wrong." John didn't reply immediately, just looked at her, the silence stretching until she couldn't stand still. Finally he tilted his head, his voice cold. "Not enough, but acceptable for now." A soft murmur spread through the cabin. Mike smirked, and Rachel Harper, the woman who had been gaping earlier, shook her head in amazement. Did she really think she was going to get away with that? Jennifer's face burned with humiliation, but she remained silent. She had been humiliated enough and things weren't over. As she turned away, John spoke again. One more thing. Jennifer froze. Yes, Mr. Maverick? He wasn't smiling, not gloating, just staring intently. When the plane lands, remember this moment. Because this isn't over. A chill ran down her spine and she understood immediately. The punishment had only just begun. Jennifer turned back, her steps stiff as she headed towards the galley, her heart pounding, her breath short. John's gaze, calm, controlled as if he already knew the outcome, made her shudder. As she passed through the curtain separating first class, she gripped the counter, trying to keep her balance. Everything was spinning. Her mind replayed the past few minutes, the passengers' whispers, the way John dismissed her forced apology. She had never been in this position before. She was always in control, the one who decided how everyone was treated. But not this time. Ethan Parker, the young flight attendant, stood nearby, his arms crossed and hesitated. Not going too well, is it? Jennifer glared at him, her voice strained. Not the time, Parker. But Ethan didn't back down. I told you from the start, don't mess with him. Jennifer scoffed bitterly. Oh, you think you're so smart, huh? Think you understand how things work around here? She pointed towards the curtain. People like him don't belong in those seats, you don't? She cut herself off, knowing she was about to say something she shouldn't. Ethan's face hardened, his voice low. People like him? You mean a decorated veteran? Someone who bled for this country? Someone who has more money than you'll ever make in your life? Jennifer gritted her teeth. I don't need a lecture from you. Ethan shook his head, stepping closer. You thought you were untouchable, but I saw Grayson Carter's face on the screen. You're not getting away with this. Her hand clenched into a fist, wanting to scream, wanting to put him in his place, but she couldn't, because deep down she knew he was right. She turned away, grabbing a tray of drinks to keep her hands busy, her fingers trembling. Ethan sighed, looking at her for a long moment before saying, Brace yourself. Jennifer didn't answer, just stared at the tray, the reality slowly sinking in. She had controlled this cabin to her liking for so many years, and now she was the one being brought down. Jennifer gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white, her breath ragged, her pulse racing. This wasn't just a bad day, it was the complete collapse of everything she had built. She had always walked with authority, forcing passengers to respect her, obey her, no one dared to challenge her. But what now? The whispers, the judgmental glances, even the crew were looking at her differently, all suffocating her. She glanced over and saw Ethan standing in the corner of the galley, not smirking, not gloating, just watching. Ethan Parker wasn't smirking, wasn't gloating, but his gaze, a gaze that bordered on pity, made Jennifer Brooks' stomach clench even more. She didn't need anyone's damn pity, she needed a way out of this mess. For a moment, she thought about calling the cockpit, playing her hand first to quell the storm that was coming. If she retold the story in a way that made it sound like she had been misunderstood, maybe they would go easy on her. But as soon as she reached for the phone, the speaker in the cabin crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. The whispers in the cabin ceased immediately. We have just received new instructions from the company regarding seating arrangements in first class. Crew, please ensure all passengers are seated in their correct seats. Jennifer's hand froze around the phone. Passengers weren't stupid. This announcement was anything but normal, and it had nothing to do with safety. It was aimed directly at her. She could feel it now, the weight of what she had done pressing down like an anchor around her neck. The company wasn't just considering, they had already started to act. Ethan shifted slightly beside her, whispering, I bet that announcement was for you. Jennifer gritted her teeth. Don't hover around me like a fly. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. Listen, I know you think you can handle this, but you can't. You crossed a line and now you just have to wait for the consequences. Jennifer narrowed her eyes. What do you know? But her words lacked force because deep down she knew it well. And when the plane landed, her career would never be the same. In the first-class cabin, John Maverick sat still, watching the passengers fidget in their seats, glancing furtively ahead. Rumors spread like wildfire. Even if they hadn't seen the slap, everyone had heard enough to know there was major drama. Mike Donovan, sitting nearby, chuckled, She's panicking, you can tell. John didn't reply immediately, just ran his hand along the cane, his fingers tracing the familiar lines. He had been through battles, had seen people collapse under pressure. Jennifer Brooks was no different. Just another person about to self-destruct. Mike leaned closer, asking, Why didn't you shut her down the moment she started questioning you? John tilted his head, finally looking at him. Because people like her only learn a lesson one way. Mike smirked, nodding. By losing everything? John didn't smile. By being forced to see who they really are. A few rows back, Rachel Harper, who had been quietly watching, turned around. Do you think she'll actually realize it? John exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the front of the cabin. Depends on what happens next. Because this wasn't just about punishment, it was about whether Jennifer Brooks was the kind of person who faced the truth, or would forever run from it. The flight continued as if nothing had happened, but everyone felt the change. The atmosphere in first class was different now. Passengers weren't just watching a flight attendant do her job, they were waiting. Waiting to see what happened when the plane landed, waiting to see if Jennifer Brooks' reign in this cabin would collapse right before their eyes. John remained motionless, his posture relaxed but his mind sharp. He had been in situations where patience was survival, where calmness was the only way to win. This wasn't a battlefield, but the principle was the same. The enemy always defeated themselves, he just had to wait. Mike sipped his drink, glancing at John with interest. I've been in business a long time, and I've learned one thing about people like her. He swirled his glass, watching the liquid ripple. They don't think they can lose until it's too late. John nodded slightly, because they've never faced real consequences. Rachel leaned forward, lowering her voice. I still can't believe she dared to slap you. Did she really think she would get away with it? John. Mike chuckled softly. And you will, won't you? John didn't answer, he didn't need to. In the galley, Jennifer stood near the counter, her hands gripping the metal edge so hard that her fingernails dug into her palms. Her body felt hot, her uniform like it was strangling her. She had splashed cold water on her face, but the heavy feeling in her chest hadn't gone away. She knew she was in trouble, obviously, but she couldn't accept it. No way. She had spent years building her reputation, controlling the first-class cabin like a queen, ensuring that all passengers respected her authority. That's how she had climbed to this position, how she kept everything under control. She didn't make mistakes, she gave orders. But what now? She was trapped in a nightmare where she was the one being put in her place. Ethan Parker stood nearby, arms crossed, watching. He had seen flight attendants come and go, but never had he seen anyone so blind to their own downfall as she was. After a long silence, he spoke. After a prolonged silence, Ethan Parker finally spoke up. Do you have any regrets about what you did? Jennifer Brooks stiffened, her voice strained. What did you say? Ethan tilted his head, unimpressed. You're pacing around like you're the victim, like someone stealing something from you. But you slapped a passenger, humiliated him in front of everyone, and not just anyone but someone who owns this damn airline. Jennifer swallowed hard, but her pride wouldn't let her admit defeat. I didn't know who he was. Ethan scoffed sarcastically. Oh, so if he was just a regular veteran it would have been okay? She didn't answer. Ethan sighed wearily, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? Jennifer gritted her teeth, her anger boiling. You think you're better than me? She stepped closer, her voice low and menacing. You think you're untouchable? Ethan didn't flinch. No, but at least I don't go around slapping people. People who paid good money for their seats. Jennifer's face burned, but before she could snap back, the speaker in the cabin crackled again. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. That simple command made her stomach drop. She looked towards the cockpit, a cold fear creeping up her spine. Throughout the flight, she had managed to avoid reality, but when the wheels touched down, everything would change. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. When we land, they'll be waiting for you. Jennifer's hands clenched into fists. She knew, but she wouldn't give in so easily. Not ever, and now wasn't the time to start. In the first-class cabin, John Maverick fastened his seatbelt, his fingers idly running along the cane. He wasn't worried, there was nothing to worry about. He had faced worse things in his life, this was just another example of someone abusing their power and reaping the consequences. Mike Donovan stretched, glancing out the window as the plane began to descend. What's the plan here? You're not just going to let them suspend her, are you? John tilted his head. What do you think I should do? Mike smirked. Make her a lesson for everyone. John breathed slowly, he wasn't cruel but he believed in accountability. And Jennifer Brooks was about to understand what that meant. As the plane entered its final approach, the atmosphere grew heavier, passengers whispered, glancing around. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. Rachel Harper shifted in her seat, glancing at John. Are you really going to ruin her career? John didn't look at her, just stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. She's already ruined it herself. The plane descended steadily, the engine roaring, the runway visible through the window. Passengers were tense. Some pretended to scroll through their phones, others peeked furtively ahead. The murmuring had ceased, replaced by a silence as heavy as an impending storm. John sat still, his hand resting lightly on the head of his cane, not hurried, not anxious, but everyone could feel the weight emanating from him. Jennifer, on the other hand, felt suffocated. As the captain announced the landing, she knew she only had a little time left in the air, the only time separating her from what awaited her on the ground. And she knew exactly what awaited her. She had seen it before, flight attendants being pulled aside after landing, escorted away for a talk that never ended well. Some were lucky enough to be transferred, warned and given a second chance. Others never returned to flying. But this time was different. Not a minor argument about seats, not a disgruntled passenger causing trouble. This wasn't something she could brush off as a misunderstanding. She had laid hands on the owner of the airline, someone who could end her career with a single phone call. She felt eyes everywhere, passengers watching, Ethan standing a few steps away, arms crossed, his eyes unreadable. Even the other flight attendants kept their distance, exchanging quiet, meaningful glances that made her want to vomit. They all knew. As the plane touched down with a slight jolt, Jennifer took a deep breath, her hands pressed tightly against the edge of the galley counter for balance. The speaker crackled, the captain's voice echoing through the cabin. "Welcome to your destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us." Normal, familiar, but to Jennifer it sounded like a death sentence. The wheels rolled smoothly on the runway heading towards the gate. Her heart pounded. Through the gap in the curtain separating first class, she saw them. 2 uniformed security guards standing at the jet bridge, next to a sharply dressed man in a black suit holding a shiny black tablet, checking something. Without seeing their faces, she knew the company had arrived. In first class, Mike Donovan whistled softly, leaning towards John, nodding towards the security guards. "They're not wasting any time." John simply adjusted his grip on the cane, exhaling slowly. "They won't." Rachel Harper fidgeted in her seat, her eyes fixed on the scene ahead. "Are they really going to drag her away in front of everyone?" Mike smirked. "Looks like it." But John wasn't gloating, wasn't satisfied, he just watched, waited, his face expressionless. Because this wasn't about humiliating Jennifer Brooks. It was about her learning a lesson. In the galley, Jennifer wiped her sweaty hands on her uniform, trying to steady her breathing. She needed a plan. Was there something she could say to get out of this? If she blamed it on a moment of impulsiveness, if she called it a misunderstanding, if she said John hadn't looked important enough, maybe they would believe it wasn't so serious? But no matter how she thought about it, she knew the truth. There was no escape, no excuse, no justification. 4 years she had made quick decisions, trusted her instincts, judged people with just a glance. And today, those instincts had betrayed her. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft ding. Passengers unfastened their belts, stretched, reached for their bags, but no one stood up. They waited, waiting to see what would happen next. Jennifer took a deep breath, straightened her uniform and squared her shoulders. If this was the end, she wouldn't let herself look pathetic. She stepped out of the galley, moving forward with measured steps. As she reached the curtain separating first class from the exit, the man in the black suit looked up, Grayson Carter. Her chest tightened. His face was expressionless, but his eyes said it all. Jennifer stopped just before the doorway. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to say. Grayson looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Brooks, come with us." Not a request, she had no right to refuse. The cabin was silent, no one moved. The clicking of seatbelts, the opening of overhead compartments, the whispering of passengers wanting to leave, all disappeared. Only tension remained, heavy, unavoidable. Jennifer stood at the head of the plane, back straight, hands clutching at her uniform. This couldn't be happening, shouldn't be happening, but Grayson Carter's look told her it already had. Grayson Carter usually sat in fancy offices at company headquarters, high above the skyscraper, far from where the real work took place. But when guys like him showed up in person, it was never good news. The 2 security guards stood on either side, close enough to remind Jennifer Brooks that she had no way out. She wouldn't be leaving this flight as a respected chief flight attendant. She was being led away like a criminal. Grayson took a slow step forward, tilting the tablet to check something, then looked up at her. His eyes were without warmth, without pity. "Brooks," he said smoothly, his voice calm but sharp as a knife, "leave the plane immediately. You are not authorized to assist with deplaning." Jennifer's throat constricted. She knew arguing was useless. But the feeling of being watched by all the passengers, the humiliation of being dragged off her own flight, it felt like it was suffocating her. "Sir, a word slipped out, small but dangerous." Jennifer swallowed the fire in her chest, her nails digging deep into her palms. There was no other way. She slowly, stiffly turned and walked past him to the exit, each step like wearing lead. She could feel the eyes. The passengers who had seen everything, who had heard the slap, who had witnessed her humiliating someone they now knew was a big shot in the airline industry. Rachel Harper, who had been silent throughout the flight, finally spoke. "Guess first class has a new seating policy." A few people chuckled, amused. Mike Donovan smirked as he watched her leave. Ethan Parker didn't laugh, didn't gloat, just shook his head. Jennifer ignored them. She had no other choice. She stepped off the plane, her heart pounding like it wanted to break out of her chest. As her feet touched the jet bridge, she realized how bad things were about to get. Right at the exit, another man in a suit was waiting, not a regular boss, not a lowly manager, but Robert Walsh, the company's legal counsel. Jennifer's stomach twisted. This wasn't just discipline. This was a legal matter. Robert folded his arms, his eyes as cold as ice, locking onto her. "Brooks, come with us for a formal review." Her throat tightened. Formal review was HR's way of saying your career is over. On the plane, as soon as Jennifer disappeared, the passengers began to move, seatbelts clicked open, overhead compartments clattered, the post-flight chaos returned. But the atmosphere wasn't normal. There was an electric current in the air, a feeling that everyone had just witnessed something rare, the downfall of someone in power. John Maverick remained seated, slowly reaching for his bag. He wasn't in a hurry, never in a hurry. Mike Donovan, his eyes still fixed on the empty doorway where Jennifer had just left, shook his head and laughed. "I've never seen anyone destroy their career so quickly." John stood up, leaning lightly on his cane, turning to Mike, his face expressionless. "She destroyed it long ago." Mike smirked. "True enough." Rachel Harper adjusted her bag, glancing at John. "You didn't have to do anything, did you?" John exhaled through his nose. "People who think they have power usually destroy themselves." Mike chuckled softly. "And you just let them do it?" John didn't answer. He didn't need to. As he stepped off the plane, walking across, Jennifer's hands trembled as she stood outside the glass-walled meeting room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Reality crashed down like a storm she couldn't outrun. She used to stride through airport hallways with absolute confidence. Uniform impeccable, back straight, a commanding presence. She was the one who set the rules, the one who gave the orders. But what now? She wasn't striding. She was waiting, waiting for the door to open, waiting for someone to call her in, waiting to hear the fate of a career she'd spent years building. Inside the meeting room, Robert Walsh flipped through a thick stack of documents. Beside him was Grayson Carter, who had barely looked at her since dragging her off the plane. But the worst was the empty chair at the head of the table. She knew exactly who it was for. As if on cue, steady footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't need to turn around, she knew it was John Maverick. Inside the meeting room, the air thickened with tension as John walked in. He wasn't hurried, wasn't angry, just his presence alone seemed to shrink the room. Grayson stood up to offer a curt greeting, but Robert didn't even bother to look up from his papers. Power had shifted. Jennifer followed behind, her movements stiff. Robert looked up, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Brooks, sit down." She hesitated for a second before obeying, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Robert glanced at John and Grayson before fixing his eyes on her. "Let's make this quick." Jennifer fought down the panic rising in her chest, keeping her face impassive. Robert continued, "Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending termination." A sharp knife stabbed into her heart, but she maintained her composure. "Your actions today were not only wrong but also put the airline at risk. Assaulting a passenger, especially a major investor, has clear consequences, Brooks." Her throat tightened but she forced herself to speak. I know I was wrong but..." "Wrong?" John's voice cut in, deep but solid as a nail being hammered in. Jennifer flinched, forced to meet his eyes. There was no anger in his eyes, only something worse, disappointment. John took a slow breath, tapping his fingers on the handle of his cane. "You weren't wrong, Brooks." Silence fell, then he tilted his head. "You made a choice." The words weighed on her like a stone, crushing her. Grayson cleared his throat. "Mr. Maverick has requested that you be removed from all flights indefinitely." Jennifer gripped the arms of her chair. Indefinitely was worse than being fired outright. If she was fired, she could fight it, claim her rights, find another airline that would overlook this incident. But indefinite suspension meant she wasn't worth the effort to fire. Stuck in limbo, unable to work, unable to move forward. In a final effort she took a shaky breath. "Mr. Maverick, I know I was wrong. I misjudged you, let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I apologize for that." John didn't react. She swallowed hard. "If I could go back I would do things differently." "I would?" She hesitated because what could she say? That she would have treated him better if she had known who he was? The words were hollow, even she knew it. John looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I have a question for you, Brooks." She sat up straight. "Yes, sir?" His next words were more piercing than the suspension order. "Would you have apologized if you hadn't been caught?" Jennifer opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no right answer, and John already knew it. The silence in the meeting room was unbearable. Not a silence of hesitation, but one that stripped away all excuses, forcing her to face the truth. Jennifer sat frozen, John's question hanging like a sword waiting to fall. She wanted to say yes, wanted to say that she would have eventually realized her mistake, would have corrected herself. But John's gaze made it clear that he knew the answer. She wouldn't have. She had never apologized, not to the passengers she had looked down on for years, not to the masses in economy class she treated like trash, not to the timid ones who timidly asked for a seat only to be snapped at by her and given a cold look. She never had to, until now. Her hands clenched in her lap, nails digging into her palms. This wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It wasn't just about the slap, not just about being fired, and not just about treating a war veteran, an airline investor, like dirt beneath her feet. This was about the real Jennifer Brooks, and realizing that made her want to throw up. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. She had to salvage something, even if it was just a crumb. "Mr. Maverick," she began, her voice carefully controlled, "I can't undo what I've done, but I am truly sorry." John Maverick didn't respond, just looked at her. She continued, I want to do something to make amends. If there's any way to fix this, I'm willing." Grayson Carter leaned forward, folding his hands together, his brow furrowed. "Fix this? What position do you think you're in, Brooks?" Jennifer tried to maintain her composure. "I mean, I want to take responsibility." John sighed slowly. "Take responsibility?" He repeated, as if the word sounded strange coming from her mouth. "Tell me, Brooks, what does taking responsibility mean to you?" Her throat tightened. She knew what they wanted, for her to quietly withdraw, accept her fate, not resist. But she had worked too long, had bled and sweat for this position, couldn't let go so easily. "It means learning from my mistakes," she said carefully. "It means proving I can be better." John leaned forward, placing his hand on the handle of his cane, his voice deep but chillingly cold. "Proving?" She hesitated. John exhaled. "If you think you need to prove something to me, you're mistaken." Jennifer's stomach churned. "This isn't about whether I forgive you or not," John continued, tilting his head slightly, "nor is it about whether you're remorseful or not. It's about whether you're willing to clearly see who you are." Jennifer's breath hitched. She had never really looked at herself. She took pride in her position, in her power, had worn her seniority like armor to control, to scorn, to decide who deserved respect, who didn't. And today she had scorned the wrong person. Someone who wouldn't give her an out. Grayson sighed, glancing at his watch. "Brooks, we're not here to negotiate your feelings. We're here to finalize the last step of your departure from the airline." Jennifer's chest tightened. Last step. Departure from the airline? She knew it was coming, but hearing it so plainly made it real. She opened her mouth, intending to argue, to say something to mitigate the penalty, but John shifted slightly in his chair, and his next words shattered any last hope. "You don't belong in the sky anymore." Simple, definitive. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. She had spent so many years in the air, it was all she had, but John had just taken it away with one sentence. Grayson nodded. "Effective immediately, you are permanently banned from working for this airline in any capacity." Jennifer blinked rapidly, trying to push back the sting in her eyes. She had imagined being suspended, maybe fired for a year. She could manage that. But this? She was completely done for. Robert Walsh, the legal counsel, finally spoke, his voice dry. "You will receive official notification of your termination, and this will be reported to the industry regulatory agency. If you attempt to conceal this or falsify your record with future employers, we will sue." Jennifer could barely hear him. Everything around her was a buzzing noise. The airline wasn't just firing her, but ensuring no one would ever hire her again, preventing her from ever setting foot on a plane. She swallowed hard, her voice a whisper. I understand. John looked at her for a long moment, then leaned back. Good. The word stabbed into her chest like a dagger. She had spent her entire career passing judgment on others, and now she was the one being judged, with no chance to appeal. Jennifer sat motionless, her breathing shallow, her entire world collapsing in less than an hour. The chair beneath her felt unsteady, as if she were still in the air, caught in a whirlwind that swept away everything she once controlled. But she wasn't airborne anymore, she wasn't flying, she was falling. Grayson tapped his fingers on the table and glanced at Robert. Do we need anything else from her? Robert didn't even look up from his papers. No. Everything will be sent through official notice. Termination letter, incident report. It's done. Done. That word cut deeper than she had expected. For so long she had been the one demanding answers, barking orders at the crew, deciding which passengers were worth paying attention to. Now she was just another redundant employee, discardable. Grayson pushed his chair back and stood up. That's it then? Jennifer's heart clenched. Was that really all? No appeal, no last chance, no way to prove she could change? She forced herself to stand, her hands trembling as she smoothed her uniform. She had worn this outfit for years, but today, it felt like a costume, ill-fitting, foreign. John Maverick didn't rise immediately. He sat there, studying her intently. His face showed no satisfaction, no gloating, just quiet certainty. Finally, he stood, picked up his cane, and walked out with steady, controlled steps, exuding natural authority without needing to demand it. Jennifer had never hated anyone more because deep down she wasn't just envious of his power, she envied his certainty. He never had to prove himself the way she had. He didn't ask for respect, he already had it. She had fought her whole life for control, but now that she had lost it, she realized she had never truly possessed it. John glanced at Robert. I assume security will escort her out? Robert nodded. Of course. Jennifer's chest tightened. She didn't even have the dignity of leaving on her own. The conference room door opened and two security guards stepped in, their expressions unreadable. They didn't grab her. They simply ensured she left quietly. The humiliation was unbearable. She wanted to resist, to turn back and scream at John that he was wrong about her, that she wasn't a cold, power-abusing tyrant. But wasn't she? Hadn't she spent years treating first-class passengers as superior to those in economy? Hadn't she treated travelers like trash simply because she could? Hadn't she looked at John Maverick, an aging veteran, a paying customer, entitled to his first-class seat, and decided he wasn't worthy of it? The weight of it crashed down on her like a boulder. John walked past her without a word. He didn't need to say anything, her sentence had already been passed. Jennifer Brooks would never board a plane again. Outside the meeting room, the hallway was eerily silent as she stepped out, flanked by the two guards. Beyond them, the world continued as usual. Passengers moved through the terminal, announcements echoed overhead, people hurried to catch their flights. But for Jennifer, everything had changed. She passed by several uniformed employees, people who once nodded respectfully when she walked by. Now they didn't even look at her, she was no longer one of them. At the elevator leading to the employee exit, Ethan Parker appeared from around the hallway corner. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan sighed and shook his head. I warned you. Jennifer didn't respond. What was there to say? He was right, they were all right, and now she had to live with it. She stood before the elevator doors, their cold metal reflecting a person she no longer recognized. The uniform that had once symbolized power now weighed heavily on her shoulders. Pristine fabric, polished nameplate, all meaningless. She had walked through this airport 1,000 times, head held high, knowing people respected her authority. Now she was being escorted out like a criminal. Ethan stood a few steps away, arms crossed, watching her, not quite pitying, not quite mocking, just understanding, as if he had seen this outcome long before. The elevator chimed softly as the doors slid open. The two security guards flanked her as she stepped inside, their presence suffocating. They didn't drag her, but they didn't need to, it felt the same. The doors shut, cutting her off from the world she once controlled. For a long moment, there was only silence, the hum of the elevator filling the tight space. Jennifer watched the floor numbers light up, counting down each level. She breathed slowly, lips pressed together. She wouldn't cry, she refused to cry, but the sinking weight in her chest told her she had lost more than just a job. She had lost everything. Elsewhere in the terminal, John Maverick left the meeting room, his cane tapping rhythmically against the polished floor. His steps were steady, unhurried, his expression calm. Mike Donovan caught up to him, adjusting the strap of his bag. "That's it then?" John didn't answer right away, just kept walking, eyes forward. Mike let out a short chuckle. "Gotta admit, I thought it'd be more dramatic. You didn't say much to her." John glanced over. "Didn't need to." Mike smirked. "Cold?" John shook his head slightly. "No. Just final." Rachel Harper, walking a few steps behind, spoke up. "Do you think she learned anything?" John paused, turning slightly to glance toward the glass-walled meeting room where Jennifer had just sat. His jaw tightened for a brief moment, but his voice remained steady. "That depends." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Depends on what?" John met his gaze. "Depends on whether she blames herself or blames everyone else." They continued toward the terminal exit, the noise of the airport surrounding them. The world moved forward, the flight was over, and Jennifer Brooks was no longer their concern. At the employee exit, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Jennifer stepped into a hallway unlike the sleek, polished floors of the main terminal. This was the back end, where staff came and went, hidden from the public eye. This was where she would leave. The two security guards walked beside her, not rough, not cruel, just doing their jobs as she once had. At the exit door, she hesitated. The weight of reality crashed down. This was what she had avoided her whole life, the moment she had no control. She had commanded, enforced rules, made sure people knew she was the one in charge. Now she had to step out of this building knowing she would never return. One of the guards spoke, his voice neutral. "Ms. Brooks." Jennifer's fingers tightened around her bag strap. She could still fight, still argue, still say something. But what was left to say? She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. A gust of cold air hit her face, sharp against her skin. She stepped outside and the door slid shut behind her with a final click. And just like that, Jennifer Brooks was gone. The weight of her downfall crushed her chest. Behind her, the airport stretched wide. Engines roared, announcements echoed, passengers rushed to catch flights. Flights she would never take again. For the first time in years, she felt small. The reality of it was suffocating. She had been somebody. She had mattered. Now she was just a name on a termination report. The wind cut through her uniform, but she didn't move. She had nowhere to go. Her car was parked in the employee lot, but she wasn't ready to leave. Leaving meant accepting this was real. She exhaled sharply and forced herself to walk. Her heels clicked against the pavement, but the sound was different now. No longer confident, no longer powerful. No one looked at her. No one cared. She reached her car, hands trembling as she unlocked it. The door creaked as she slid into the driver's seat, fingers gripping the wheel. And then it hit her, she had nothing left. Her job was her life, her purpose, the place where she had control, where she decided who mattered and who didn't. For years she had defined herself by power. Now she didn't know who she was anymore. She rested her head on the steering wheel, her breath trembling. The airport would continue without her. Planes taking off, passengers boarding, flight attendants assuming their positions. Everything running smoothly as if Jennifer Brooks had never existed. Because she wasn't needed, never had been. Her jaw clenched. Is this really the end? Is this how it all ends? Her mind spun with options. Appealing the decision, fighting back, finding another airline willing to take her despite that damn report haunting her forever. But deep down she knew the truth. No airline would take the risk of hiring her. She wasn't just a disgraced employee, she was a liability. She closed her eyes. It can't be like this. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, that she had control over everything, that she set the rules. But John Maverick had taken it all away, not through shouting, not through arguments, but through sheer infuriating patience. He hadn't needed to crush her. He had simply let her arrogance destroy her. She thought of the way he had looked at her, not angry, not triumphant, just certain. She had mocked him, humiliated him, even slapped him, yet he had still treated her as someone worth acknowledging, even when he could have crushed her instantly. He had let her dig her own grave. She let out a bitter, empty laugh. Maybe that was the worst part, he had given her a choice the entire time. She could have stopped, stepped back, taken one more look at that damn ticket, realized her mistake and saved herself. But she hadn't. And now she was nothing. Her fingers dug into the leather of the steering wheel. For the first time she wasn't angry at John Maverick, she was angry at herself. The ringing of her phone cut through her thoughts. She reached for it instinctively, her trembling fingers unlocking the screen. A message from an unknown number. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Jennifer Brooks, your employee file has been updated. Your termination paperwork has been processed. All company privileges and benefits have been revoked, effective immediately. The final nail in the coffin. Her hand went cold. The message continued. Your behavioral review has been submitted to the National Aviation Management Board. Any future employment attempts in the airline industry will require full disclosure of this incident. Her heart plummeted. She hadn't just lost her job, she had lost her way back in. She thought the worst was over, it wasn't. With shaking hands, she locked her phone and threw it onto the passenger seat. She stared at the dashboard, her mind blank. Nowhere to go. No plan. No future in the career she had devoted her entire life to. The weight of it all was crushing. For the first time since stepping off that plane, she allowed herself to feel it, and for the first time in years, Jennifer Brooks did something she had never permitted herself to do. She broke down. Silent, unstoppable tears streamed down her cheeks as she gripped the steering wheel, her body trembling. She had spent her entire career believing she was better than the people she looked down on, and now she was one of them. Someone left behind. Someone with nowhere to go. Someone with no one to blame but herself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this.